Trust fund? What trust fund? Those 4 words changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The call came at 7:12 on a rainy Tuesday morning, just 3 weeks before my 18th birthday. I was sitting at our kitchen table in Cedar Grove, Ohio, eating a bowl of cereal before school when my phone lit up with an unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something made me answer. "Is this Logan Reed?" a calm male voice asked. "Yes. This is Benjamin Hayes. I'm the attorney handling your grandfather Arthur Reed's estate." I sat up a little straighter. My grandfather had passed away nearly 10 years earlier. "Okay," I said cautiously. There was a brief pause. "Logan, your mother knows we need to schedule the final review of your trust fund before your 18th birthday, correct?" I stared out the kitchen window as rain tapped softly against the glass. "My what?" Another silence followed, this one longer. "Your trust fund," he repeated. "The account established by your grandfather for you." My stomach tightened. "I think you have the wrong person." "I assure you I do not." I looked toward the hallway, half expecting my mother to appear. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. "I don't know anything about a trust fund," I said. Benjamin Hayes sounded genuinely confused. "Your grandfather left detailed instructions. The fund transfers fully to you when you turn 18. I couldn't speak for a moment. Growing up, money had always been a source of stress in our home. My mother, Victoria Reed, constantly reminded me of that fact. She clipped coupons. She complained about utility bills. She said college would probably require loans because there simply wasn't enough money. I had worked weekends at a grocery store since I was 16 because I believed every word she said. "How much is in it?" I finally asked. The attorney hesitated. "I think that's a conversation we should have in person." My heart began pounding. "Can you at least tell me if it's real?" "It's very real, Logan." After we ended the call, I remained frozen at the table. My cereal had gone soggy. My hands felt cold. I remembered my grandfather suddenly, his deep voice, his warm smile, the way he always used to say, "One day, kiddo, you'll understand why I planned ahead." Back then I assumed he was talking about life lessons. Now I wasn't so sure. That afternoon, I watched my mother differently. She came home driving the same silver Mercedes she'd bought 2 years earlier. She complained about gas prices while placing expensive takeout containers on the kitchen counter. She talked about bills. She talked about sacrifices. She talked about how hard everything had been since my grandfather died. But for the first time, I noticed something else. Whenever I mentioned Grandpa Arthur, a shadow crossed her face. Whenever I asked questions about the past, she changed the subject. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the attorney's words over and over. A trust fund, an inheritance, a transfer at 18. And somehow, I knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something had been hidden from me for years. And whatever the truth was, it was waiting on the other side of my 18th birthday. I did not sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Benjamin Hayes asking the same question again. Had my mother told me about the trust fund? The answer was still no. By sunrise, I had convinced myself there had to be some mistake. Maybe my grandfather had intended to create a fund but never finished it. Maybe the attorney had confused me with another client. Maybe there was a simple explanation that would make all of this disappear. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me throughout the day. At school, I could barely focus on anything my teachers were saying. My thoughts kept drifting back to my grandfather. Arthur Reed had been the one constant in my childhood. When I was 8 years old, he taught me how to fish at a small lake outside Columbus. When I was 10, he gave me my first toolbox and told me that a person should always learn how to build something with his own hands. He never talked much about money, at least not directly, but there were moments that suddenly felt different now. I remembered one summer afternoon when he handed me an old baseball glove. He smiled and said, "Some things are worth protecting until the right time comes." At the time, I thought he was talking about the glove. Now I wondered if he meant something else entirely. After school, I stopped by the grocery store for my shift. Stocking shelves usually helped clear my head, but not that day. Around 6 o'clock, my friend Tyler asked why I looked distracted. I almost told him everything, but the words felt too strange to say out loud. Instead, I shrugged and blamed a lack of sleep. When I got home, my mother was sitting at the kitchen island with her laptop open. Papers were spread across the counter. The moment I walked in, she closed the screen. It happened so quickly that most people would not have noticed. But I did. "How was work?" she asked. "Fine. Good. We need to start talking about college expenses again." I nodded and grabbed a bottle of water from the refrigerator. Do you think Grandpa left anything behind? I asked casually. Her reaction was immediate. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just a slight tightening around her eyes. Why would you ask that? I was just thinking about him. She looked away first. Your grandfather was a good man, but there was not much left after medical bills and taxes. The answer came too fast, almost rehearsed. I said nothing. A few minutes later, she started talking about utility costs, property taxes, and how expensive everything had become. Normally, I would have listened without thinking twice. This time, every word sounded different. That evening, after she went upstairs, I sat alone in the living room. Family photos lined the shelves. In almost every picture, my grandfather stood beside me with his hand resting on my shoulder. As I studied those photographs, a realization settled over me. For years, I had accepted every explanation I was given because I trusted the person giving it. Now, for the first time in my life, I was beginning to wonder whether trust had been my biggest mistake. The following Saturday, I decided to stop guessing and start paying attention. It was amazing how many things appeared unusual once I stopped accepting them automatically. My mother spent years convincing me that our finances were always on the edge. She talked about budgeting almost every day. She reminded me to turn off lights when leaving a room. She complained whenever grocery prices increased. Yet the details around me told a different story. That morning, I watched her pull into the driveway carrying several shopping bags from a luxury outlet mall nearly 40 miles away. She noticed me looking through the front window and smiled. There was a clearance sale, she explained before I even asked. I nodded. The explanation sounded reasonable. But later that afternoon, I found the receipts sitting on the kitchen counter. Nothing about them looked like a clearance sale. One handbag alone cost more than I earned in 2 weeks at the grocery store. I quietly returned the receipts exactly where I found them. Over the next few days, similar moments kept piling up. A subscription for a country club I had never heard her mention. Expensive restaurant charges appearing in notification emails that flashed briefly across her phone screen. Weekend trips she described as business meetings. None of these things proved anything by themselves. Plenty of people spent money in ways that did not make sense to others. Still, the contradictions bothered me. One evening, while helping clean out boxes in the garage, I discovered an old photo album. Most of the pictures were from summers spent with Grandpa Arthur. Fishing trips, baseball games, backyard cookouts. As I turned the pages, a folded note slipped onto the floor. It was written in my grandfather's familiar handwriting. The message was short. For Logan, some gifts are safest when protected from the wrong hands until the right time arrives. There was no date, no explanation, just those words. I read them 3 times. A chill ran through me even though the garage was warm. That night, another strange thing happened. I came downstairs for a glass of water just after midnight and saw light coming from the home office. My mother rarely stayed awake that late. Through the partially open door, I saw her sitting at the desk reviewing documents. Several pages were spread across the surface. Before I could step closer, she quickly gathered everything into a folder and closed it. You should be asleep, she said. Her tone sounded calm, but her expression looked startled. Could not sleep, I replied. Big week coming up. She forced a smile. Yes, your birthday is almost here. For a brief second, neither of us said anything. Then she added, 18 is just a number, Logan. It does not really change much. I returned to my room, but those words stayed with me. 18 is just a number. According to Benjamin Hayes, 18 changed everything. The closer my birthday came, the more I felt an invisible clock ticking somewhere in the background. I still did not know the full truth, but I was becoming certain of one thing. My grandfather had hidden something important for me, and someone else had been hoping I would never find it. 2 days later, I finally met Benjamin Hayes in person. He suggested a small office on the edge of downtown Columbus, far enough from my neighborhood that nobody would recognize me. I told my mother I was meeting a guidance counselor to discuss college applications. The lie sat heavily in my stomach, but by then I had started feeling like everyone around me was hiding something. Benjamin was older than I expected, probably in his 60s, with silver hair and the calm manner of someone who had spent decades handling difficult conversations. He greeted me warmly and led me into a conference room. A thick folder rested on the table between us. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he opened the folder and slid a document toward me. At the top was my name, Logan Arthur Reed. Below it were account numbers, legal language, and financial summaries that made almost no sense at first glance. Your grandfather established this trust shortly before his death, Benjamin explained. His instructions were very specific. I stared at the pages. How much money is actually in it? Benjamin folded his hands together. The current estimated value is approximately $2.8 million. The room seemed to tilt. I actually thought I had heard him wrong. $2.8 million? He nodded. The trust included investments, property interests, and several long-term accounts that have appreciated over time. I looked down at the documents again. For years, I had worried about paying for textbooks. I had spent weekends stocking shelves to save for community college. I had skipped school trips because money was tight. None of it made sense anymore. My mother knew about this? I asked quietly. Benjamin hesitated before answering. She has served as trustee since your grandfather passed away. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. So she has known the entire time. Yes. The word landed harder than I expected. Benjamin continued carefully. Being a trustee carries legal responsibilities. The trustee manages assets until the beneficiary reaches the specified age. I swallowed hard. Can I see everything? He studied me for a moment before opening another section of the folder. There were statements, reports, and transaction records. Most looked routine. Investment adjustments, administrative fees, tax filings. Then I noticed something else. Several withdrawals. Some were small. Others were not. One payment exceeded $40,000. Another was nearly $25,000. What are these? I asked. Benjamin's expression became difficult to read. Those are among the issues I hope to discuss with you. My pulse quickened. He slid several pages closer. Some expenditures were documented. Others raised questions. I stared at the numbers. Luxury vehicle payments, travel expenses, consulting reimbursements. The descriptions were vague, but a pattern was beginning to emerge. A terrible pattern. Suddenly, I remembered the Mercedes in our driveway, the expensive shopping trips, the constant claims that money was scarce. For the first time, the pieces started fitting together. My grandfather had spent years planning for my future. Someone else had spent years controlling access to it. As I sat there flipping through page after page, one realization became impossible to ignore. Whatever was happening was much bigger than a misunderstanding. And whatever my mother was afraid of, it was connected to the day I turned 18. When I left Benjamin Hayes's office, I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes without starting the engine. The folder rested on the passenger seat beside me. Every few seconds, my eyes drifted back to it as if the numbers might somehow change. They did not. The evidence remained exactly where it had been all along. I drove home in silence, passing familiar streets that suddenly felt different. For years, I believed I understood my life. I thought I knew why we struggled financially. I thought I knew why my mother worried constantly about money. Now, every memory seemed uncertain. That evening, I spread copies of the documents across my bedroom floor and studied them one by one. The more I read, the worse the picture became. Some transactions were easy to identify. Luxury hotel charges, airline tickets, payments connected to high-end retailers. There were also recurring transfers labeled as administrative expenses. Individually, they might not have attracted attention. Together, they represented hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years. I kept looking for an explanation that would make everything reasonable. Maybe there was one. Maybe I was missing some important detail. But each page seemed to point in the same direction. Around 9 o'clock, I heard my mother's car pull into the driveway. A few moments later, she came upstairs and knocked lightly on my door. I quickly stacked the papers and slid them into a drawer. "Can I come in?" she asked. "Sure." She stepped inside carrying a mug of tea. Her expression looked unusually cheerful. "I was thinking about your birthday," she said. 18 is a big milestone. I forced a smile. "I guess so." She sat on the edge of my desk chair. "There are a lot of adult responsibilities that come with it. Financial decisions, legal paperwork, long-term planning." My pulse quickened. The conversation felt carefully chosen. "Sounds exciting," I replied. "It can also be overwhelming," she said. "Sometimes young people rush into things before they are ready." She looked directly at me. "There is nothing wrong with letting experienced people help manage important matters." For a moment, neither of us spoke. I wondered how many times she had practiced those words. Then she smiled again and stood up. "Just something to think about." After she left, I sat motionless. The room felt smaller. Somehow, her comments echoed through my mind. Experienced people help manage important matters. It sounded innocent on the surface, but after everything I had learned, it felt like a warning disguised as advice. The next afternoon, Benjamin called again. His voice was calm, but I sensed urgency beneath it. "Logan, there is another document I think you should review." "What kind of document?" I asked. "One that may explain why your mother suddenly seems interested in discussing adulthood and financial responsibility." My grip tightened around the phone. "What is it?" There was a brief pause. "A petition draft. It appears someone has been preparing paperwork that would allow continued control of certain assets beyond your 18th birthday." My heart sank. Until that moment, part of me still hoped I was misreading the situation. That hope disappeared. For the first time, I stopped asking whether something was wrong. The real question had become how far this plan actually went. For the next several days, I stopped acting like a confused teenager and started paying attention to everything. Not openly, not dramatically. I simply listened more than I spoke. It turned out people revealed a surprising amount when they believed nobody was watching. My birthday was less than 2 weeks away. The closer it came, the more my mother's behavior changed. She became unusually interested in my schedule. She asked where I planned to go after graduation. She wanted to know whether I had chosen a college. She even started asking questions about my future career plans, conversations she had rarely initiated before. On the surface, it sounded like concern. Underneath, it felt like preparation. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and found her speaking on the phone. She immediately lowered her voice when she saw me. "I will call you back," she said quickly before ending the conversation. Then she smiled. "Just insurance paperwork." I nodded and grabbed a soda from the refrigerator. But as I turned away, I noticed a legal pad sitting on the counter. Most of the page was covered by another folder, but one line remained visible. "Extended fiduciary oversight request." The phrase meant nothing to me at first. Later that night, I searched it online. My stomach tightened as the results appeared. Several articles discussed legal petitions used to maintain financial control when a beneficiary was considered unprepared to manage assets independently. The next morning, I forwarded screenshots to Benjamin Hayes. His response arrived less than an hour later. "We need to meet again." That afternoon, I sat across from him in the same conference room. He looked more serious than before. "Logan, I believe your mother intends to argue that you lack sufficient financial maturity." I stared at him. "Can she actually do that?" "She can try." Benjamin opened a file and slid several pages across the table. "The concern is not whether she wins. The concern is timing. If paperwork is filed before the transfer process is completed, complications can arise." The invisible clock I had felt for days suddenly became very real. "How much time do we have?" I asked. "Not much." He pointed to several dates highlighted on a calendar. My birthday sat at the center of all of them. Everything seemed connected to that single day. Every conversation, every document, every suspicious withdrawal, every carefully chosen word. Benjamin leaned forward. "There is something else you should know." My pulse quickened. "What?" "Last week, someone requested copies of several trust administration records." "My mother?" He nodded slowly. "We cannot prove it directly, but the request originated through channels connected to her legal representative." I looked down at the calendar. For years, I had assumed my 18th birthday would be a celebration. A simple milestone. A cake. Friends. Family. Maybe dinner at my favorite restaurant. Instead, it was becoming a deadline. A finish line that someone desperately wanted to move farther away. As I left the office, one thought followed me all the way home. My mother was not preparing for my future. She was preparing for the moment she might lose control of it. From that moment on, I decided to stop reacting and start performing. If my mother believed I was still the same teenager she had always managed, then I would let her keep believing it. At dinner, I talked about school, work, and graduation plans. I laughed at the right moments. I asked harmless questions. I never mentioned Benjamin Hayes, the trust, or the documents. The more normal I acted, the more relaxed she seemed to become. That was exactly what I needed. 3 days remained before my birthday. The atmosphere inside the house felt strangely calm, like the quiet before a storm. One evening, my mother suggested we celebrate early with dinner at a restaurant downtown. In the past, I would have been touched by the gesture. Now I studied every detail. Throughout the meal, she kept returning to the same topic. Responsibility. maturity, guidance. She spoke about how difficult adulthood could be and how important it was to avoid making major financial decisions too quickly. A lot of young people make mistakes when they suddenly have access to resources, she said while stirring her iced tea. Sometimes they need someone experienced to help them stay on the right path. I nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. Her expression softened. I am glad you understand. For the first time in days, I saw genuine relief in her eyes. She thought the conversation was working. She thought I was accepting the role she had planned for me. The next afternoon, I received another call from Benjamin. He had obtained additional records. We met briefly at his office, where he showed me copies of correspondence connected to the petition. Reading the documents felt surreal. The language was polite and professional, but the message was clear. Someone was building a case that I lacked the experience necessary to manage my own inheritance. Several statements painted a picture of an irresponsible teenager who needed continued supervision. As I read, I barely recognized the person being described. Benjamin watched me carefully. "How are you holding up?" he asked. I looked down at the papers. Honestly, better than I expected. That answer surprised even me. A week earlier, I would have been devastated. Now something had changed. The shock was fading. In its place was clarity. Every document revealed another piece of the truth. Every attempt to control the situation exposed the plan even further. That evening, I returned home and found my mother decorating the dining room for a small birthday gathering. Balloons sat in a corner. Wrapped gifts rested on the table. To anyone else, it would have looked like a loving parent preparing for an important milestone. I stood in the doorway and watched for a moment. "Looks great," I said. She smiled warmly. "I want this birthday to be special." I smiled back. "Me too." Neither of us added anything else. But as I walked upstairs, I realized something important. We were both waiting for the same day to arrive. The difference was that she believed it would secure her plan. I knew it would end it. The morning of my birthday arrived gray and quiet. I woke up before sunrise and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. For weeks, everything had been moving toward this day. Every document, every conversation, every suspicious detail had led here. Yet the house felt completely normal. I could hear my mother moving around downstairs. Coffee brewing, cabinet doors opening and closing. The sounds of an ordinary morning. By 8 o'clock, I was sitting across from Benjamin Hayes in a conference room. The folder on the table was thicker than ever. Additional records had been gathered. Transaction histories had been reviewed. Legal notices had been prepared. The atmosphere was calm, but beneath that calm sat years of unanswered questions. Benjamin checked his watch. "We are ready." I nodded. My hands were steady. That surprised me. A month earlier, I would have been terrified. Now I felt something different. Determination. The transfer process was scheduled to activate later that day. Before that happened, several protective measures needed to be finalized. Independent review requests were submitted. Documentation was secured. Notifications were prepared for the relevant financial institutions. Every step had one purpose: preserve the trust exactly as my grandfather intended. Nothing more, nothing less. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Do not be late for dinner. Everyone is excited to celebrate." I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "I will be there." The simplicity of the exchange almost made me laugh. She had no idea where I was. No idea what was happening. No idea that the timeline she had spent months preparing for was slipping away minute by minute. Later that afternoon, Benjamin handed me a final document. Once this is processed, certain actions become significantly more difficult for anyone attempting to interfere. I read every line carefully before signing. The moment felt strangely quiet. No dramatic speech. No confrontation. Just ink on paper. Yet I knew my grandfather would have appreciated that. He had always believed important decisions should be made calmly. As the final pages were filed, Benjamin smiled for the first time that day. "Congratulations, Logan." "For what?" I asked. "For protecting your future." When I finally drove home, the sun was beginning to set. Cars lined the street outside the house. Friends and relatives had already arrived for the birthday gathering. Through the front window, I could see decorations and balloons. Laughter drifted through the evening air. Everything looked exactly as it should have. I parked at the curb and sat for a moment before getting out. My phone buzzed one final time. A brief message from Benjamin appeared on the screen. "The protections are active. The review process has officially begun." I read the message twice before locking my phone. Then I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door. Inside, everyone believed the celebration was about to begin. What none of them realized was that the most important part of this day had already happened hours earlier. When I opened the front door, the room erupted into applause. Family friends filled the living room. Neighbors I had known for years stood near the dining table. A large birthday cake sat beneath a banner hanging across the wall. For a moment, everything felt normal. My mother walked toward me with a bright smile and wrapped her arms around my shoulders. "Happy birthday," she said. "Thank you," I replied. She looked genuinely pleased with herself. That was what struck me most. She seemed completely confident, completely certain the evening would unfold exactly as she expected. The party moved along smoothly. People talked, laughed, and shared stories from my childhood. Several guests handed me cards and gifts. I thanked each of them sincerely. Through it all, I watched my mother. Every time someone congratulated me on becoming an adult, I noticed a small flicker in her expression. Not anxiety, anticipation. She was waiting for something. Then, shortly after dinner, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and immediately excused herself from the room. Most people did not notice. I did. A few minutes later, she returned. The confidence was gone. Her smile looked strained. Her eyes seemed unfocused. She picked up a glass of water but barely touched it. Another 10 minutes passed before her phone buzzed again. This time she read the message in front of everyone. The color drained from her face. I did not need to see the screen to know what had happened. The review process had reached the people who needed to know. Questions were being asked. Records were being examined. The protections were active. My mother looked across the room toward me. For the first time in weeks, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. "Logan," she said quietly, "can we talk for a minute?" Several guests continued chatting, unaware of the tension forming beneath the surface. I nodded and followed her into the kitchen. The moment the door swung closed behind us, silence filled the room. She placed her phone on the counter. "Did you know about this?" she asked. I looked at the screen. Legal notifications covered the display. "About what?" I asked calmly. She stared at me. The review. The records. The trust. There it was. The word she had hidden from me for years. I held her gaze. "Yes," I said. "I know about all of it." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she sank into a chair. Suddenly, she looked older than I had ever seen her. "You do not understand everything," she said softly. "Maybe not," I replied. "But I understand enough." I thought about my grandfather, about the promises he made, about the years I spent believing there was nothing waiting for me, about the documents, the withdrawals, the petition, and the carefully constructed story I had been told. Strangely, I did not feel angry anymore. I felt free. "Grandpa trusted me," I said. "That is why he made the decisions he did." My mother lowered her eyes. Outside the kitchen, I could hear laughter from the party continuing without interruption. Life was moving forward. "What happens now?" she asked. I glanced toward the living room where friends and family were celebrating. Then I looked back at her. "Now the truth gets reviewed," I said, "and my future belongs to me."